recording now. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Nickel and Dime's International Relations Foreign Policy Cluster Roundtable for the month of November. In this roundtable, we will be discussing the COP28 summit held recently, and the meeting will be moderated by Dhimant. So Dhimant, please start.
Hello, everyone. I welcome you to this roundtable. So, the first question I have is how can nations balance their economic development alongside with environmental sustainability? Because it has been argued many times that you have to balance these things. You cannot have economic development alongside with economic sustainability. What is your opinion on that?
I think it can be done through adopting strategies which are more in line with the developmental goals, especially SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. There can also be inclusion of, international policies like the SDGs into the local, not the local per se, but our domestic frameworks, legislations where these incorporated policies could really make a difference into the larger issue of addressing issues such as the one that you mentioned, climate change and security, etc.
Interesting points, Nakul. I also feel that it can be balanced in a way, but the issue is that for many of the people, many of the economists, we have is what role can the international organizations play to promote environmental sustainability in cases of climate change, and how can the effectiveness be enhanced? We saw in COP28, we saw the Paris Agreement. So, what is your opinion on that?
So the thing about provisions such as the one that you mentioned is that much of it is rarely being incorporated in, especially into the domestic legislations and frameworks of countries, especially when we talk about, the Paris agreements and Montreal protocols. All of these legislations do not have had such a binding effect as they should, essentially. So the changes that they recommend can actually be taken into place, and much of can also be attributed to the fact that a lot of nations also ratify these agreements. So I think one of the major issues lies in that.
Yes, please, Arshita.
Yeah, so adding on to what Nakul said, it's actually if we look at the pattern which climate summits have followed over the years, and there has been large-scale agreement that the Rio summit was where we achieved a peak in terms of the impact that it had on countries across the globe. Since then, especially since the Johannesburg summits, there has been a sort of feeling that it has failed to have the sort of impact necessary in terms of implementation. We look at the working of the UNEP across countries, and we see that they have been so focused on creating new institutions, but they fail to capitalize on the sort of implementation which these institutions can actually have across sectors in terms of making sure that climate security is achieved. So that is something that instead of focusing on creating new institutions, we need to focus on how to implement the existing policies at hand.
Yes, valid points, Arshita. Tanish?
It's a very basic point, but I think countries in the global south are something that we have to have more priorities towards. So it's important to give them developmental assistance because these countries cannot exactly afford to go for many of the different ways to combat climate change. And it's important for these countries to develop because as they economically develop and go through that necessary phase, they'll pollute a lot more, at least in terms of per capita. So that's something that's also very important in regards to international organization.
Interesting points here because development always follows pollution. So moving on, as you mentioned, different countries. What impact do you feel the current geopolitical events like the war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza would have on the struggle against climate change on a global scale?
First and foremost, I don't think these geopolitical tensions or events that are taking place are actually affecting they're not being a hindrance to the organization per se, because you see COP28 was still held in India, and many of these summits are still being taken into place. Like, I recognize that there's a geopolitical tension and war going on, but I do not think that it is affecting the institutional machinery at place. Like, all the UN meetings are going as and well they should. Everything is performing smoothly. Everything is functional pretty much. So, but in regards to the specific impact on climate change, I do believe that, just based on the sheer amount of weapons that are being used, especially with the technological advancement that Israel has, incorporated into their arsenal, it's absolutely going to have an adverse impact on, the global warming temperatures and the energy resources, especially because countries such as Israel and, and areas lying in Palestine, these are also, regions who are not rich in resources per se, especially natural resources. So when they're going to be using these technologically advanced weapons, and I think it's going to heavily impact, people's access to these natural resources, which already is not in, very large quantity. It's a dart to say. So yeah, that's going to be the specific impact that I believe.
Um, Very interesting points you made. I also heard they are planning to flood the Gaza tunnels to flush out Hamas fighters, but that would have an adverse impact. Yes, Harshita.
It's a very basic point, but as we see countries headed towards greater investment towards military securitization, it will necessarily have an impact on the amount of investment which is made towards climate securitization. If we look at the recent trend of how funds were raised during COP28, the US, while the total fund ranged to, I think, 770 million, the US, which is the largest carbon emitter in the globe, it actually only contributed around $20 million, which is a very paltry amount. And of course, given its involvement in wars across the globe and its commitment towards securitizing and laying its own interests, it necessarily impacts climate investment in an adverse way. So, the climate is an issue which requires global cooperation between countries, and wars such as these are definitely they act as a precedent towards deteriorating collaboration between countries. So yeah, I believe that geopolitical tensions have a very negative impact, and it will hamper global cooperation, especially in arenas of technology transfers down the run.
Interesting point, Harshita. Yes, Tanish, please.
Again, a very basic point that I want to add is that bloc politics might have a very big role to play here. So between the Chinese and the Americans, the sort of bloc that is created between the West and the rest, or the global South versus the global North, like I said last time, it could hamper geopolitical, a shift towards combating climate change, and it could add a lot more tensions. So I think at the COP28 summit as well, there were disagreements between officials from Gaza and Israel, or there was like there's a lot of bloc politics going on. The like, geopolitical tensions do hamper climate change agreements to some degree, but I also largely agree that it's not going to make much change in the larger sort of question, because if you also look at what we had to do with the ozone layer, it was countries like Iran and the US who agreed with each other, and then we combated that issue. So I think over time, geopolitical tensions, sorry, will not play a very large role in trying to, combat climate change or sort of, hamper the progress.
Yes, bloc politics has been present in almost everything right now because of the rising tensions between the global powers. And now moving on, what do you feel can be innovative steps to bring these global powers together to solve the climate change? Because this issue won't affect Russia, it won't flood Yekaterinburg, it will flood everything. It will flood New York, it will flood Tokyo, it will flood Beijing. So what do you feel can be innovative approaches to bring together these countries?
I don't think this is an innovative approach, but one of the things that India is doing, that the Indian government is investing heavily into the production of e-vehicles, like cars that are being produced solely based on, e-cars. In fact, a lot of funding has been done into private MNC setups by the Indian government. A lot of barriers are being defeated by the Indian government to let, Tesla come in and install their practice in into India. So I think one of the things that the countries can effectively do so without being so innovative but rather basic is that they can hope to achieve a transition towards an economy where cars are not being used by petrol but rather being powered by electricity. So I think that's one of the steps that can really help accelerate our goals and visions.
Yes, Danish.
I think an important aspect of not just innovative approaches to technologies, but in general, when it comes to climate change, is holding corporations to account. So, with the help of not just the governments, but also the private sector, I think it would be pretty important, like building upon Nakul's point, with Tesla, for example. So, not only holding corporations, to a degree where they can help climate change, but also holding them accountable. I think around, I'm not sure about the source, but I read somewhere that 70% of the world's carbon emissions, sorry, are done by like 100 corporations alone. And I think it is stats like these that drive me to think that corporations should be held accountable to the amount of pollution that they do. And I think having the private sector as a major part of the discussion could help a lot.
Yes, please, Rashita.
Yeah, from a social and political angle, there's this organization called EDF, which has actually initiated something called climate parliaments across South Asia, especially to sort of decarbonize the rural scenario in South Asia. And it effectively engages people from rural communities and lets them have a say in community-based agricultural practices and how they can take a step forward in terms of decarbonizing them. So something like that, which can actively create a sort of platform between legislators at the upper echelons of government and between rural communities and how they can collaborate together when it can present sort of an innovative solution from a social perspective.
Uh, that's a very interesting point, and I believe that it's a high time that we need to coordinate our efforts. So, Nakul, you wanted to say?
I think adding on to Tanish's point, when we say that we need to hold corporations liable, there's also this thing called environment tax that a lot of the EU nations have proposed to, incorporate into the legislation, which is basically saying that corporations which are producing, carbons much more than their cap should be held liable to pay an environment tax in lieu of their, violations. And one of the things that corporations love to do is reduce their costs. So I think that will be a good incentive for them to reduce their, carbon usage. And this was something that can really help and have an impact, especially on the corporations.
Yes, I believe now it's a high time to forget all politics about power blocks, about being in a geopolitical influence, and to work on the betterment of humanity because we have only one planet we can argue on about. And I believe that all of this won't matter in the future if we don't have a planet Earth to dominate over. That's all from this center, and we hope to see you on the next one. Thank you.